word about animals on the Mark Thompson Show.
And our lovely visitor to A Word About Animals, Karen Dawn from DawnWatch, everyone. DawnWatch, the daily animal world news watch. You can find DawnWatch on Facebook and beyond. She has a very active following, a newsletter that I really enjoy, kind of looking at animal issues as they're covered in the media. How are you, Karen? Welcome.
I'm great. I feel like I get invited to a very intelligent party every Monday.
Oh, that's so sweet. Well,
That's how it feels
here. Well, please add to the party. What do you have for us today?
Well, I think a little bit of animal cruelty always adds to every party, don't you think?
Oh my God!
What?
No, last week
we were talking about Flaco. And that I was calling Flaco. Now, again, is it Flaco or Flaco?
It's Flaco. I think it's Flaco.
Okay. How did Flaco say it before Flaco's untimely passing?
Ooh, ooh, ooh.
Good. Okay. Well, then. Anyway, you were talking about, and we actually released your video as a short, and there was a lot of reaction to that, and it seemed like a heartbreaking story no matter where you stood on things. So tell me, what was the follow-up?
Which is why we're revisiting this week, and of course we're going to find the lemonade in the lemons and some of the things that have followed his story. But yeah, people were very, very moved by Flaco's demise. They were in love with his story, soaring around New York, and then quite distressed when he got killed, but we kind of knew that he would.
And remind everybody just briefly,
for those who, in case there might be people watching who not only didn't see us next week but might have somehow missed Flaco. Flaco's an owl who was let out of his enclosure by a bunch of vandals a year ago at the Central Park Zoo, which is owned by the same people who own the Bronx Zoo. It's the World Conservation Society, which everybody thinks is, one of the world's best zoos. And that's something that Mark and I touched on last week, which is that no matter how good a zoo is, it's still captivity. And even at this supposedly wonderful zoo, the New York Times wrote that Flaco had been living in an enclosure about the size of a department store window. And he was in there for 13 years before some animal rights activists, liberation activists cut the enclosure, let him out. And of course, what you and I discussed here is that, if he wanted to go back in because he wanted his 3 square meals a day, etc., he could have. He knew he was often around Central Park. He spent most of his time in Central Park. He knew where that horrible enclosure was and could have gone back and been let in, but he chose to be free. Unfortunately, it's really, really hard for animals to make it in a human environment. And I expressed the delight that at least he got to live for a year before he died. And a lot of other people seem to have felt that way. But that's what we talked about last week. This week, what I wanted to address is that just today in the New York Times, and it's not even printed yet, it'll probably be printed in tomorrow's New York Times, there's a column by Margaret Renkl, who is simply one of my favorite humans. And we've looked at her writing before on this segment when she wrote about a bunch of turtles who had chosen to lay their eggs near a volleyball court, and some students made the effort to move the eggs every single year to an even safer place. And she has such a beautiful way of looking at the world and a beautiful way of writing about it. And she talks about the fact that, Flaco couldn't have made it just the same way 250,000 birds don't make it in New York every single year. Apparently 2 billion birds are killed thanks to human activity in America every single year. And her column talks about how we've just got to do better, not just for the sake of Flaco, who we loved, but for all of these animals, not all of whom we feel quite so strongly about. And I want to mention something she mentions is that there's a couple of bills in the New York legislature which were just sort of hanging out, not doing much until Flaco's death buoyed people's emotions around this. And This is I'm sure see that Tony is now showing us the Margaret Renkl column, and I sent you guys a guest link so that you can include that in the notes on this, because DawnWatch has a subscription and I can provide guest links, gift links, because she's really worth reading. But she mentions in her piece that there's a couple of pieces of legislation. One is the Bird Safe Buildings Act, which has actually been renamed the Flaco Act. And the other is the Dark Skies Protection Act. And the irony is that neither of these pieces of legislation probably would have saved Flaco, but they might save 250,000 other birds. The reason they probably wouldn't have saved Flaco is, I didn't know this until I read Margaret's column this morning, that these acts are both designed to stop birds from crashing into buildings, but it seems highly unlikely that Flaco actually crashed into a building. His necropsy isn't out yet, but somebody looking at his injuries said, well, if he crashed into a building, he would have had a whole bunch of head injuries. That's not what he had. He had body slam injuries. It seems far more likely that he fell off his perch and crashed into the ground. His whole body crashed into the ground. And huge, big guess, but very likely is rat poison. We mentioned that last week, that when people use these rodenticides that kill rats, before the rats die, they get a bit slow, and they're therefore the ones that are most likely to be caught by birds and other wildlife. In California here, it's mountain lions. We had P22 full of rodenticide not long before he died. And in New York, it might well be that rodenticide killed Flaco. But what she talks about is that, you know what, I'd love it if Tony might put up this quote, Mark, and I said I'd ask if you'd read it because we all love listening to your voice, if he's got it there. But this is her basic point, and I want to talk about some of her points based on this. If you don't mind reading it, Mark?
Yeah, I'll read it. I also have a follow-up. The quote from Margaret Renkl is, to protect the animals we love, we'll need to think differently about the animals we do not love. To live peaceably among them, we'll need to work harder to do what wildness, I should say, requires of us. Wild animals are not our enemies. They are our neighbors. Every owl is Flaco. Looked at through the, he'll always be Flaco to me. Every owl is Flaco. Looked at through the lens of biodiversity laws, every toad and rabbit and squirrel and fox and coyote and goldfinch and cricket and lacewing and roly-poly, they could all be Flaco. We just need to learn to love them the way we loved him. It's such an interesting point that, we give this owl a name, we give this owl a story. He escaped from this enclosure that was so small, and that's a compelling story, right? He becomes a figure, a personality. But the reality is all animals who live in the wildness of it all, they're all figures and personalities that we could give names to and backstories to. I guess that's her point.
Absolutely. And whereas people might have enjoyed Ratatouille, the way we treat rats is probably the reason that Flaco, you say to Flaco and I'll say to Flaco or something.
There you go.
Tomato and tomato.
Yeah.
The way we treat rats is probably why this sweet owl, who we have to work out what to call, has died. And the lack of concern we show for the 250,000 birds who are killed every single year in New York City is also why he might be why he is dead. And so whether or not he was actually killed thanks to the way the buildings are built, the fact that in his honor they are resubmitting these bills and putting them forward again is such a beautiful thing. And one of them is to the Bird Safe Buildings Act is to enforce laws that say that buildings have to be built with birds in mind. So, for example, the kind of glass you use can make a huge difference to whether a bird flying along, depending on the way it reflects, the bird might think there's trees ahead when in fact it's just a reflection of the trees. And if you use less reflective glass, that's much less likely to happen. And with lights that are just left on all night long and completely send the birds in the wrong direction, Getting these skyscrapers to turn off their lights can make a huge difference. And it's interesting because it's almost karmic, because there's so many different reasons why we shouldn't be burning lights all night long. And one of them is to save the birds. And Flaco, it's typical of human nature to be so much more concerned about the loss of one individual than about the 250 million who are killed every year as they fly into buildings.
Well, again, and it's because we've given that one individual this sort of three-dimensional quality, but the reality is all of those sweet souls, they deserve that same consideration. They won't
And there
get
are
it,
sweet
but
souls with families and spouses, so what we call spouses, but they first realized that swans mate for life, and now they're realizing that it seems that most birds do. I mean, they're just not all that different from us.
we
And
had
they
a
need the
question
kind
for
of
you. I wonder
protection.
if you could take it from Randy, who's very active in our chat, usually has some pretty interesting
Something to
things to
say.
say. Randy says, just to ask, what's the basis for Karen's analysis of how the owl died? Every article I see on Google indicates the owl died flying into a building.
Right. Yeah, I tried to explain that, Randy. If you read Margaret Renkl's article this morning, she quotes somebody who I've forgotten who it is, but it's in there in the article, and he's more of a bird expert. He's taken a good look at Flaco's injuries, and if he had flown into a building, he would be far more likely to have head injuries. But what he's got is body slam injuries, the kind of injuries you have falling from a great height. So it seems far more likely that he fell. He was on a perch somewhere and he fell, which means he was not perfectly healthy and then flew into a building. Either way, it's human caused, whether it's that our buildings, we may have made so little attempt to make them bird proof, or because we're using these rodenticides with no concern for the horribly painful way they kill rats and also kill all the other animals who eat the rats.
Yeah, regardless, you're saying it's something
It's human killed.
that has
But
to be
yeah, this
read.
Margaret Renkl article links to another article where an expert has looked at, and again, the necropsy hasn't come back yet, so we don't know this for sure. We don't know whether he's going to turn up with rodenticide inside of him, but it seems it's looking more and more likely.
I don't want to throw you a curve, but again, it's something that's being talked about in the chat, so I will give it to you. And it is I'm sorry, now it's got let me just see, maybe I have it here. Mark, here it is. Talk to Karen, should be, about the thousands or millions of cattle being burned and killed in the Texas fires. It is a sad fact that it is unspeakably awful for the livestock being, well, I don't know to say, killed, by the fires in Texas.
Karen's going to have an unusual take on this, which is that, I'm sorry, they're being burned alive, but anybody who does any research into what animals go through in slaughterhouses, which is exactly where they were heading, know that wasn't going to be a great death either, and they were going to be trucked to these slaughterhouses with no food or water. If they weren't going to be killed for a couple of months, then it was going to be in the 110-degree Texas heat in trucks with no food and water. So I'm like, yeah, burnt alive really, really sucks. But what was being planned for them wasn't great either.
Well, that is, I will say respectfully, one of the most, it's interesting, and of course it is unusual, and it's because you wouldn't expect that, which is very much on brand for you. But I would say it's tortured, respectfully. I think that's a little like me saying to a human being, well, your last 5 years are going to be so tough with all the cancer treatments and all the rest. You're better off just being. But it's not just euthanized. You're burned alive, Karen. I'm sorry. That is a fate that's horrifying, and those creatures endured it and continue to endure it.
I think, Mark, you might not be aware that in Texas on these cattle farms, and we are talking about degrees of heat over 100, there's no rules that say that the cattle have to have any shade whatsoever. And so there's a certain percentage of cattle who die every single year simply from the elements, from the heat I'm not sure that being burnt alive in a few minutes is worse than dying of being parched, baked in the sun with no shelter at all over a few days or whatever. So
Well, I
I
mean,
get
yeah,
your
and
point,
again,
but
you wrote, is in your book. This is where I learned this fact. Your book, which I guess is being updated, they're going to come out with a thanking the monkey. I learned this, which I have regurgitated ad nauseum to various people, which is as animals go that are part of the food process, and it's all awful. I mean, really awful. The less awful is being a cow in the cattle world, in the beef world. A beef cow, not a dairy cow. Dairy cow is the other end of the extreme. It's horrifying. It's awful. We'll talk about it another time. But so I kind of am informed by that which I read in your book. But you're saying, well, yeah, but Texas cattle, you're saying, are really in bad shape. So that's a detail perhaps I wasn't aware of.
okay. First, I have to, I was sort of smiling slightly while you were talking about this awful stuff, and I just have to sort of apologize and say, it's just, to me, it's a little bit funny that I say, hey, it's so nice to show up to this party, and I'm talking about all these new rules to do with Flaco and how we're going to protect him, and then here we're talking about cattle being burnt alive, and it's like, oh my
Well,
word.
it was in the chat. It was in response to someone.
I understand. I just wanted to let people know that if they saw me sort of smiling, that was going through my head, which is that why is it all so awful? And the answer is because what we do to animals is generally awful, and there are exceptions, but it's awful. It's also in my book, Mark. I'll get you a page later, but about the fact that that cattle are not protected from the elements on some of these ranches, and they just they put it in the when they're doing their calculations of how much it costs per head of cattle, they take into account that some of them are going to die from the elements. So
sure, no, because that's the same way they were trucking
these,
them.
Yeah. As summer's coming along, I'm so sorry to hear these poor cows are being burnt up, but God knows what was ahead for them anyway. It's the what we do with livestock, with animals who we have bred to be food in this country, is unconscionable. And I'm not here saying you must go vegan, because that's not useful. And because you know what, if somebody's going out and hunting a deer who's roaming around with their family and getting shade and whatever, I mean this.
I don't. I can't believe it. Okay, all right, yeah.
I'm
so
sorry,
they're running around with their family, getting
totally
some shade,
different.
enjoying their offspring. If somebody wants to hunt them and kill them, it's fine.
It's not fine with me, and I'm certainly not going to do it, but it's an ethical issue you can talk about. I'm not going to rant about it.
There are plenty of hunters who watch the show. Yeah.
But the way we treat, and I could respectfully argue with them, but it would be respectful in a way that I'm not going to argue with anybody who supports factory farming or who supports keeping cattle out on ranches with no shade. It's just absolutely crazy and cruel the way we treat animals raised for food. And to me, it is interesting that people are so worried that these cows who had the worst day imaginable ahead of them, people are so upset that they got burnt up in a fire. Do you know there are absolutely animals raised for food who get boiled alive? We've mentioned this, I think, on the show before, that they say 1 million turkeys get boiled alive.
No, of course,
in our slaughterhouses. So, that's why my reaction is, well, that's nice that people care so much about these cattle being burnt alive. But I, would urge them, if they do care, to do a little bit more research on what happens to the animals that we are raising in our food industry, because it's so not okay.
There are great strides being made in the treatment of animals and protection of pets that are also affected by certain things that are in place to take care of pests, et cetera. We'll get to that in weeks to come. I wanted to do something about it today, but I'm out of time. Karen, thank you. Again, it's DawnWatch.com. You can also find DawnWatch on Facebook. And you're so lovely to spend time with us on Monday. So thank you so much, Karen.
It's always a joy to see you guys.
Karen Dawn, everybody. That's a word about animals for today.
Join the flock. Again next time for a word about animals on the Mark Thompson Show.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel. to help us save the universe.